My name is Dr. Parker Rugeley. I go by Dr. P. I'm a member of the programming committee for the DDNRC. Welcome and thank you for being here today. It's a pleasure to have you all here today. It's a lot of you all, so we're happy to get this conversation, this dialogue started with everyone and to be in community with everyone. So today it is trauma-informed dialogue, dialogue as an element of holistic healing praxis. Being trauma-informed in dialogue spaces requires an intentional, holistic approach that acknowledges the person first and does not frame their trauma within a deficit model where the individual needs to be fixed. Rather, trauma-informed dialogue should be part of a holistic healing praxis that acknowledges trauma and the outcome of experiencing harm enabled by systemic and historical inequities and oppressions. The webinar will offer a brief overview of deficit versus holistic healing praxis in dialogue, examples of dialogue praxis, and a panel reflection of those examples and an interactive exploration of how to develop and utilize a healing praxis when being trauma-informed. For today's agenda, we're going to go over organization overview, some introductions, trauma-informed dialogue versus holistic praxis dialogue, presenters' examples, presenters group Clara I reflection, community discussion, and then at the end, closing out with contact and connecting with us on our platforms, and also what's next going forward after this for our events in the future.
2 o'clock.
Hello, everyone. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Iona Ringgold. I'm coming to you from Towson University in Maryland. And we want to take a moment just to pause and reflect and acknowledge that where we are all in different places, spaces, and on different lands. The Difficult Dialogues National Resource Center, the organization that brings us all together here today, is based on the lands of the Georgia tribe of Eastern Cherokee and the Lower Muskogee Creek tribe. We acknowledge that we are all sitting on indigenous lands, ancestral lands and unceded land of Native peoples. These lands continue to be of great importance to indigenous tribes and other familial descendants of these bands of people. We recognize that we continue to benefit from the use and occupation of these lands. We recognize that we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible our colleges, universities, and organizations' relationship to Native peoples. As members of the higher education community, it is vitally important that we not only recognize the history of the land on which we reside, but also we recognize that Indigenous people are alive and flourishing members of our communities today. In giving a land acknowledgement, we must also recognize that saying these words is not enough. They cannot and do not undo the genocide committed against Indigenous people and the centuries of trauma that have ensued as a result of this genocide: forcible displacement from home, the loss of language, family, and tradition, the desecration of land and water that are essential to life and flourishing. These words cannot undo all that has been done, but let these words be a start, a naming of truth, an acknowledgement of where we truly are. By beginning here, it sets the course for us to move forward. We invite you to consider the lands on which you reside and work. We invite you to reflect, to know the histories of Indigenous peoples, and to know the current and present state of Native peoples in your region. If you know the lands on which you reside, we invite you to note that now in the chat. Our campus in Maryland is on the land that is the ancestral homeland of the Susquehannock, Nanticoke, and Piscataway people. And thank you so much for sharing. We see lots of sharing in the chat. We also want to share with you DDNRC, the Difficult Dialogue National Resource Center. For those of you, especially if this is your first time, you can see our purpose here, that our organization seeks to contribute to transformative change among higher education institutions and their partners by advancing innovative dialogic practices to address the multiple and persistent challenges to justice and equity. Again, we invite you to visit our website, and you can see 4 prongs of DDNRC: to lead dialogue, to advance justice, to foster transformational change, and to promote equity. We just wanted to share and acknowledge the organization today. So again, we really thank you all for being here, and we're excited to proceed with today's session.
Thank you all for being here, and we appreciate you very much. Today, we wanted to take a look at the subject of trauma-informed care and trauma-informed dialogue, but acknowledge this as a somewhat tentative and testing and exploratory way of looking at this subject, because we want it to go beyond that into thinking about a holistic healing praxis. And the reason for that will become more clear as we go over this overview of what is trauma-informed dialogue and what would be a wider holistic healing practice. So some of the things we're going to talk about are basic understanding of trauma-informed practice, basic understanding of what are some positive and negative approaches to trauma-informed practice, understanding what it would mean to be part of a holistic healing praxis, expanding on a trauma-informed process, and really thinking about that healing-centered engagement within the dialogue. And of course, an ability to recognize how trauma appears in ways to address it in a supportive, collaborative, holistic healing space. And then just think of an improved way of awareness and incorporation of more holistic approaches, both in the trauma-informed dialogue, but the post-dialogue moments of how one can support. And so that's the things that we're going to be looking at. So my name is Jen Ball. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm going to be taking you through this first piece of it. If you have not done work within trauma-informed practice or care, you may not recognize this language. You may recognize it as something that comes out of healthcare or psychology and is used to help in spaces where people have experienced trauma. It's also something that's useful to think about both in the educational space and in the dialogue space. And so that's some of what we want to look at here. Now, what I wanted to take you through very quickly is the idea of what is trauma. And so one part of trauma is what an individual experiences. And so individual trauma results from an series of events or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. And in that, you can understand the place of the individual. However, part of what we want to explore with you all is the fact that trauma can be communal and it can be generational. And it is a part of things to then understand that what produces trauma, because trauma is a symptom, it is not the thing in and of itself, that the systemic issues that produce or reproduce that trauma then require not only caring for the individual and helping to work collaboratively with that individual on their healing, but to also understand you are looking at a need for systemic change as well. And so as we look at these two framings we have here, that's why we labeled one deficit-based and one asset-based. And in a deficit-based, we look at trauma in an individual as something wrong with the individual or something the individual has to get over personally, right? So that deficit-based, and we're familiar with this often within higher ed, thinking about deficit versus asset-based understanding of our students, right? And in a deficit-based, we look at the individual in a negative light rather than seeing that the individual is much more than the trauma they're experiencing. And so in the deficit-based, people will often stay at that individual being defined, right, by others, and that the self, right, by the harm experience. So we don't allow that person to self-define. We say, oh, you're this because of this, right? In the dialogue space, this can be when people are like, oh, well, you went through that, so I'm going to see you in this light and look at all of the things that you say through this light. And that's not a good practice. It anchors the person to a specific identity, right? That decenters their own expression of self. And we're going to talk about that in some of our examples of what we mean when we say the person becomes anchored to a specific identity and they don't then have the opportunity to be fuller themselves, explain themselves in a context of community identity as well, or to move in ways that takes the trauma off of the focus. And of course, the other part of a deficit-based, when you're only looking at an individual and thinking this individual has this trauma that needs to be fixed, you don't really acknowledge root causes or the communal nature that people can experience, within which people can experience trauma. And so that's the space that you really want to think about. How do you not either set up your dialogue so it stays within that space, or if people are starting to interact with people who acknowledge some past harm and people understand it as trauma, that they then don't give that person space to move beyond that in the way that they're expressing themselves or the way that people are understanding this. And so while it's important to think of for the individual, okay, are we creating safety in our dialogue spaces, right? Are we as facilitators, as organizers of dialogue, being trustworthy and transparent so that that reaffirms and reassures the individual you're working with? Are we setting up that there is peer support for individuals, right? Community support within that dialogue? Are we addressing trauma as something that is collaborative and mutual in the way that we're thinking about how to address it, how to understand it, how to heal it? And of course, are we empowering people and giving, the space, the centering to their voice and their choice in how to acknowledge trauma, and of course, how to work with it? And then finally, are we understanding that that trauma is attached, right? It is a symptom that suggests other things around culture, history, and issues related to identity like gender or race. Those are some examples. And so really understanding that. And that's why we say you want to look at this through an asset-based approach. And that asset-driven strategy of healing is very person first. Understanding a person is always more than their trauma. It allows that person to self-define. And when we're dealing with concepts like trauma-informed or trauma, or we're talking about a healing praxis, that often takes that Western-centered educational model and say, you are this, and you have to fit within this box. And one of the things that you're trying to do in this asset-driven is not to box people in. Or if they tell you that I don't fit there, you hear them, right? And that's a really important thing to do in a dialogue space. So allowing that person to self-define, allowing for exploration of root causes and communal experience and needs. That's one of the things when you think back on that slide we showed you about the way that we believe difficult dialogues tries to center its work. It really is about thinking in the systemic as well as in the individual and how the individual is part of that relationship, right? And of course, you're looking at this to think about what is healing? What would be a healing-centered type of dialogue that moves on to steps that offer a hopeful future to individuals, that come to some sort of agreements as to how you should move forward. And that's a big part of intergroup work, is to understand you're sharing issues, you're coming to some understanding, and you're trying to work towards mutual purpose for healing. So that's how we wanted to lay this piece out for people to take a look at. And in terms of just thinking a few of these things through, you might think about community guidelines. Are you honoring that self-defining, right? For discussing something others might label as trauma. Are you creating your framing questions that allow for the exploration of root causes or communal experience? in the holistic praxis within the dialogue, are you allowing for those multiple types of knowledge spaces? And then finally, in thinking about that post-dialogue holistic, right, are you thinking about the supportive, the restorative measures, those actions that need to be taken in order for us to honor what the person is asking us to address? So what we want to now turn towards is talking about this in terms of insights and contextual examples. And so myself, Manda, and Libby, we're going to offer this out. Now, as we move into this and we think about this in terms of safety, one of the things that I do want to remind people of is when you're talking about hard subjects and they're things that you have a close relationship with or some sort of communal, familial relationship with, self-care is very important. And allowing yourself that space, allowing yourself to self-care even in the moment is important for that. So please don't think muscle through something, do things as you need to. So in terms of this first example where we see going from trauma-informed, which someone might suggest is important, necessary, really supportive when done well, it's not the entire need of an individual. It's incomplete. And so what we're looking at is to go to a full healing praxis. And so this is where we want to use some examples and talk about how can we do this. So when it comes to sexual violence and you're thinking about things like how that's addressed in higher ed, well, one of the primary ways it's addressed through higher ed is Title IX. And one of the things to remember about Title IX is even though it's part of civil rights legislation meant to address sexual violence, intimate partner violence, right? And stalking, that law is actually about removing barriers, right, from education. It's a systemic thing, right? And so on one hand, it's meant to systemically think about how you are making it possible for a person who's experienced some sort of harassing or assaulting trauma based on an identity, right? That they then can heal or find some sort of restorative practice and be able to be made whole. And of course, the other thing is in Title IX, you're not supposed to just address that one individual. You're supposed to look at your whole system and say, what can I do to prevent this going forward? Which of course, when we look at something like sexual violence, we realize it's far larger than higher education itself. And how are we changing those things in society to address this, right? Now, in terms of thinking about this in a dialogue example, there is within this space often things like take back the night events. And those are actually called technically outcry events in the legislation for Title IX and the regulation. And one of the things about those events is they can often be very powerful dialogue events. The thing is, you have to think about who's there, who is not there, right, intentionally, and what kind of support you have there. But those events can often be very healing events for individuals, particularly if you do not enforce a type of performativity for the individuals. And so over the years, working with different groups of students, I have seen these events be very different. Some people want a public event. Some people want to walk with at the end, a room where there's a private talk for individuals who've experienced some sort of sexual violence only. Other times they want to arrange it where they're working with supportive counseling individuals. Sometimes they want peer advocates there. And you really have to understand that how you're creating those dialogue spaces are very important. One of the things I would be very careful of, though, when thinking about this is if you're thinking about doing this in an intergroup way, you have to understand who is in that space and if the people in that space could be potentially people who have harmed someone who is in that space, and how are you going to deal with that? And so those are some of the things in terms of thinking about the healing praxis is, okay, you create that space, you have that outcry. What are the supportive measures that you're willing to either put in place at that moment or agree to going forward? Like, if all of the individuals who've experienced that trauma get together and they say, hey, this is a consistent thing that we see after having that dialogue, then you probably need to be ready to address that systemically at your institution. That's the kind of thing when you're talking about healing practice. It's not just about the therapeutic, it is about the systemic. How are you going to address this moving forward? So that's one of the ways that you can look at being trauma informed in the moment, of allowing people to self-define and self orchestrate certain types of healing processes. But we're going to move on to a couple of others, and then the next one is going to be done by Manda, talking about how to use certain dialoguing techniques and thinking about it in terms of restorative practice. So Manda, are you ready?
I am ready. Thumbs up if everyone can hear me. Libby, you can hear me? Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Yeah, so Manda Wittebort, prefer no pronouns. At Southwestern University right now, was at University of Florida before. And so I have both participated and facilitated dialogues with high school students through older adults, and in many settings in the basement of a library, and then most often in educational settings like higher education, high schools, and beyond. So just to give you an idea of the places that I've seen the work done. To me, as we were like talking a lot about this as a committee for many months and like how we wanted to approach it, something that I feel like Jen shared, but I just like kind of wanted to restate too, is that we're not saying that we have the answer or the theory for being trauma informed. We are sharing perspectives on how we've gone about it and from the space of dialogue specific. So we know that people are professionals in many spaces around trauma informed. And if you're talking about therapy, if you're talking about groups, it's all different. And so we just wanted to that's why we want to share our examples, because these are ways in which we've actually been able to practice some of this. And so for me, trauma is a piece of the puzzle. Everything matters, right? I think people had a resistance for a while to the word resilience being used left and right, because people didn't want to be seen for just their resilience, because they're like, I didn't choose the things that I had to be resilient against. But that's also not the same thing as not honoring their resilience. Like it can be both and. But we want to move past someone just surviving, and we're talking about their stories of, I like to call it big T or little t traumas, and adding the components of what it could look like to be thriving. And to me, those are those collective components in those systems. I'd also say trauma-informed dialogue is not seeking to re-traumatize participants by forcing them to share their traumas. There's lots of terms for it. I'm sure I call it like trauma seeking, where it's like we're only asking questions that like you kind of have to answer in a way that would expose you, or just that you have to have the answer that's being seen as trauma by other people, right? And having to prove yourself. And that's not the kind of space that we want to create. And so truly figuring out how to create a space that's challenged by choice is something that I've been trying to figure out and will continue in my work, but that I hope to. One of my co-conspirators, she taught me a long time ago to share that stories are gifts and that no one owes us their story. And I like to share that at the beginning of dialogues so that people know that we're going to honor their story, but also if they're not ready for it or they don't know our group well enough, that is their choice. That's a gift for us that they get to bestow. And so I wanted to share one specific kind of example of an experience. I was working for a university before. I was a coordinator and a lot of our work was with student facilitators who were absolutely amazing in my opinion. And so they were trained in a weekend-long training before. And so we came back in the spring and we wanted to do a retreat just for them because they're always the facilitators and never the participants. So we were doing a student facilitator training where our leadership team, which was all students except for myself, were facilitators so that everyone else could just be a participant. And part of what we did, so it was a whole day long, these were with people who already knew each other some and who were trained in the practice of dialogue. So we were like, okay, we want to touch on topics that are deeper. We have some of those built relationships. We're going to be together for a day. And so we did caucusing specifically on social, on income and on class. And in there, social economics, sorry, my brain spaced there. And so the idea was that people would have a brave space to be able to share with folks who were in a similar experience to them in their childhood. One important part that I wanted to note on this that we felt like was trauma informed is one, we told them the topic before, so they weren't prepared to self-select. And then two, we had them decide which group they feel like they personally identified with. And we told them they don't need to prove anything. And that was really important to us, was that they were able to self-select and process before. And we defined it by whether growing up you didn't have enough, you had enough, or you had more than enough, because we wanted to not get stuck in the like theory of this. So that was great. We did that. And piece of it, I was in the group of having not enough. And our experience of our group, which I'm just going to share very broadly because it's their stories, was really one around like healing and connection. We were a smallest of groups. People really like got in there. They shared deep things, but they were sharing with people who had similar experiences. So they didn't feel like they were just going to be seen for the fact that they reused their mom's purse, who reused their grandma's purse, or, whatever the story was. And so we were over there passionate, and the group was really loud. You couldn't really get us to move when we were supposed to be transitioning. And I, as the overall facilitator, was paying attention to the sides of the room, and I was noticing the group that was far over, that was the more than enough group, had a very different kind of dynamic going on. It was much quieter. I know those students pretty well. They're not typically quiet, but I stayed with my group and let the facilitators kind of do their role. After, as we were letting people have a break before we were coming back together to do a different version of a dialogue, I noticed a few of the facilitators like debriefing, talking very heatedly. And so I went over and I was like, hey, I'm just checking on how your group went. And they explained that they had an incident that was, nothing high level harm, but definitely was jarring to them. And one seemed more jarred than the other. And it was a student who expressed they thought that this was a safe space to express their privilege and maybe wanted some sympathy for how it was hard to be wealthy, because they basically felt bad for their wealth and they weren't sure how to wrestle with it. And the facilitators felt like they challenged them as a way to think about, this isn't necessarily a space for that. And they kind of rerouted a new question. And it turned into this student feeling very like ostracized and expressing that in the group, in the dialogue. And so from there, the immediate thoughts that I was having was like, okay, we are still going to be together for a few more hours. What are we going to do, and who's going to do something with it, right? Instead of just ignoring it. And so took a moment for the two facilitators, asked them to come outside with me. And they had said, no, Amanda, we already have a little bit of a plan. And one of them that was feeling more like maybe their participant was more targeted at being upset with her for challenging. She was like, I would like to pull them aside and just kind of check back in, see how they're doing, and see if they want to talk more with me later. And that was really important to me, that the power dynamic in the room could have been like, ooh, I don't know, this could have gone really wrong. I'm the staff member that gets in trouble if this student, reports this to somewhere. But instead, I was like, no, this is going to be a moment that this facilitator has also now registered as hard for her. I want her to be able to like continue this process. So she checked in with the participant after, which felt very important, but then also gave them space to, kind of walk away if they needed it for a minute. And then later, like after that day, I followed up with the whole facilitator group. And then the two facilitators there shared more of what happened, shared more of the emotional experience they were going through and why it brought up stuff for them around their own income levels. And then we talked through who we wanted to have reach back out to the student and what type of processing we wanted to have. Do we want to focus on the emotions of that student? Do we want to focus on like why this was relevant to dialogue? Yeah, so that's kind of the general setup. I won't share more of the details because the purpose of what I wanted from there is just the quick, clear setting that because we were caucusing around people who had some kind of shared identity, those experiences were different. And where one group experienced healing and honestly almost some joy, another group experienced deep tension around that same identity. And then the power dynamic that came up too, and I know if it was because those were really trained facilitators, they knew it was important not to lose that student and not to be like, if we just say nothing, hopefully they'll be okay. Right? Like we wanted them to know that like we wanted them part of our group and here's where this other person was coming from. So kind of like another learning opportunity. And so that will always stay close with me, especially because it actually mirrors an experience I had like 6 years before at also a retreat where it was also between people of similar identities, where we actually did a processing dialogue circle in the retreat because it was such an intense experience that we did a dialogue about the dialogue. So I can share about that with anyone who wants to know later and like how we went about that. It was not comfortable. I was a facilitator of it, but it was really important and people were still upset, but they at least felt cared for and they felt heard. And so circling back around to our system actually perpetuating what we wanted, which was a community of care and that no one gets ostracized, but also that we stick back to our topic of power. A few of the like tips that are less about that example and things that I've used to create spaces and that were part of the work we had set up was, of course, community agreements, as Jen mentioned earlier. The two in particular that I'd like to highlight is that I actually got this from Planned Parenthood. They call it the sharing your scars, not your wounds. And a scar is something that if you hold it up, it is physically healed, but you can still see it. You still know the story about it. A wound, if you rip the physical Band-Aid off, you might like open it back up, or it is already bleeding underneath there, or you're not quite sure how to heal it yet. And so it doesn't tell people they can't talk about deep stuff, but it says if sharing this story is going to, you're not in a place to share it yet, then this group setting isn't the place. And that's what Planned Parenthood would say. That is more of a therapy space with a good friend. We can't care for you in the way that you might need to be cared for. And then the second one is asking for bravery and not promising safety. I imagine many of you already do that by talking about brave spaces and not safe spaces, but I don't want to make any assumptions. But I really love when people have shared with me, like, I can't promise you safety. I don't know what's going to trigger you, and I can't control what other people say. So it would be a lie. My old boss used to say it's a lie when I say I can like, this is a safe place. I don't know what safety looks like for you. Bravery is active and we all have to do it. And so then I would say, like, we ask for bravery and we can take responsibility as a group for repair. And that's what the example I gave above earlier is like, whether we think that student's perspective is correct or not is not the point. It's going back in between relationships, repairing the relationship. And then lastly, I'll say around question choices is also something, right? Like not starting with trauma, scaffolding, and where you start to where you go, and then going through towards action and going back to systems, I find gets people to move from like their individual experiences or other people's experiences of trauma back into a space of hope, which doesn't mean that we're not aware of what's going on. And so a question I ask sometimes is, what do you wish people knew more about your community? Or your social identity, maybe that you're sharing about. And then my other students came up with the idea of doing a jar of hope at the end of our retreats. And everyone goes and writes something that when they're not in a space like this, where they feel connected, what refills their jar of hope? And what can they return to when these systems and these things feel really heavy? And I've used that in lots of spaces now with different age folks, and it seems to go pretty well. So one of my stories, some things that I pulled on my experience, and I'm going to pass it to Libby.
Thanks, Amanda. Glad to be with you all. My name is Libby Roderick. I am the director of the Difficult Dialogues Initiative at the University of Alaska Anchorage. She, hers, and I am on the lands of the Dena'ina people here. I wanted to echo what Amanda said, which is that we are not attempting to be trauma professionals in this space, and recognize that many of you here, and I'm seeing some of my colleagues from the University of Alaska Anchorage, which is lovely, have much experience in this arena, and we're hoping that you'll share with us after we're done with this. We're going to have a broader discussion. Would love to hear from everybody. This is a time when I think we all need to collaborate with one another. Given all the things that are happening in the world, we need the best ideas coming from every direction we can find. So in terms of what I will offer to you, I work around the nation, mostly with faculty, training them in ways to engage in or help their students engage in productive, difficult dialogues in the classroom. That's primarily what I do. But I, of course, work quite a bit in Alaska. And we have 7 major indigenous nations here in Alaska. And so many of the difficult dialogues that I assist faculty with, that I conduct myself, that I'm called in on, what have you, involve issues related to our indigenous nations. And they can be anything from the impacts of institutional racism and genocidal policies, to climate crisis, to resource development impacts, to the boarding school issues that are very much up and alive for people these days, and more, right? And it's reasonably well recognized that there is intergenerational trauma that has been due to the impacts of colonization in the state. Less well recognized, in my opinion, that the people who've moved to the state are bringing their own traumas with them and inflicting them often on other people. So I wanted to just share, when I am in that space as a dialogue facilitator, some of the things that I do. certainly, as we've done here, of course, land acknowledgements is kind of basic at this point. But in my case, I spend some time, I'm born and raised in Alaska, have spent a lot of my time in native spaces. I tell my own story. I tell where I come from, how my people got here to Alaska, why they came to a certain extent, and the fact that I am personally, profoundly, profoundly grateful for and transformed by the genius of Indigenous nations and peoples and cultures and elders and so on around me. So when I am running a dialogue that has anything to do with those issues, I take the time to do that. Sometimes when it's appropriate, I get the permission of a tribal chief or a leader in the area in which we are conducting a dialogue, because that is part of the protocols of the nations that I know of. And when possible, I find and support Native folks to facilitate the dialogue rather than myself. And my job then is to support them in any way I can, logistically and other ways, to make that work however they have chosen to have it happen. Sometimes the thing that makes the most sense is to do that in a partnership. So I am there, but I'm in partner with my Alaska Native colleague, who is, again, sort of, I'm taking their lead in terms of how things should progress. We have already mentioned, and I think all of you already do, using guidelines for agreement before a discussion. I use those that have come from my Native colleagues. So, for example, I was on the board of something called the First Alaskans Institute here for a number of years ago. Was initiated a major project on racial equity dialogues around the state, and they developed a brilliant set of dialogue agreements. We can see if I can find them and post them for anyone to use. It's by the First Alaskans Institute. They're beautiful agreements. And so I will use those dialogue agreements. So they're coming from the people that are most at stake in the dialogue. Many people use this already, but one of the ones that I like the very best is that they say the simple one of listen to understand and speak to be understood. I'm sure many of you have heard that, but it's very useful when people then begin sharing their stories. And I have worked with some faculty folks recently, so that people are oriented from the beginning, that if stories start to surface, we listen to understand, we don't argue back, we don't comment on them, we don't challenge them in some way, that our role is to actually listen to try and understand what this person's experience is. We do leave plenty of time for stories. Storytelling is a central protocol and way of moving in Native spaces. But as people have already said, no one is expected to share their story if they don't want to. And framing it as a gift, I think, is a brilliant way of doing that. That was mentioned earlier. I always speak to colonization, that we are having these dialogues in the context of now years, decades, quite a long time of fairly significant colonization impacts in our state, and how that has left imprints on people. I also always speak to the fact, because, and I believe it in my soul, that Indigenous nations hold much of the genius that the world needs these days for us to proceed forward if we choose to, and hope to survive into the future for all life on the planet. So the framing is from the standpoint of learning from Indigenous nations and peoples, while acknowledging, obviously, the massive impact of colonization trauma on folks. We often use the talking circle model. Again, it comes from Native protocols, and so it's a great way of engaging in a dialogue that honors those legacies. We usually add listening partnerships, which I teach in difficult dialogues work, and many of you do too, so that at any point when things, stories start to come up, pain starts to come up, and so forth, people have a place to take it into a sacred space, which will not be shared with other people and which will not be challenged by anyone, so that we can begin to metabolize some of the things that are coming up for people. I pull my examples from Native cultures when I have examples to share. And I'll say one more thing, there is a 3-step process that I've taught for a while that came from the National Coalition Building Institute about how do you respond to unawarely racist comments or unawarely oppressive comments. I employ that We had an earlier webinar here from the DDNRC about conversation blockers that Jen shared that you can access. We can send you a recording of that, where if people begin to say things in a dialogue where they're going to be potentially oppressive to somebody in the group, how do we respond so that we continue to move the conversation forward and protect the person or people who might be on the wrong end of that. I'll stop there. I will put again into the chat, we do have 2 books that have come out of, well, we have multiple books actually that have come out of our Difficult Dialogues initiative, but 2 that are most pertinent to this conversation. One is called Start Talking. It's a handbook for engaging difficult dialogues in higher education that is primarily aimed at helping faculty engage in productive, difficult dialogues in the classroom. There's a host of strategies, including some from our Indigenous peoples. And then even better in that regard, we have a book called Stop Talking, Indigenous Ways of Teaching and Learning and Difficult Dialogues in Higher Education, that really forefronts the fact that, again, in my opinion, the dominant culture has more to learn from Indigenous nations than the other way around, which I think speaks to this whole concept of a healing framework, that people are honored for their strengths and genius, and certainly not seen in the deficit way that they have been for so long in our culture. So I hope that's useful, transferable to your own spaces. I realize most of you are probably not engaging in conversations with that particular population, but I'm hoping that many of those suggestions could be transferable to the ones you are having. So I think I'm kicking it to Parker. I'm not sure.
I'll jump in. I think it's more first, or I'll speak and then maybe Jen is something a little bit different, but is that just the 3 of us reflecting, if anything, from each other's that we heard before then we go into opening up to the group discussion. So I'll buy my fellow presenters time in case they want to think, for everyone to know the part after this will be, if you have some questions for us that you want, please put those in the chat, and Parker will be moderating that piece to make sure we're not a mess on just unmuting and everyone talking to each other. So you'll be able to share that in chat, or if you want to share it orally with your voice, Parker will call on people as they see people's hands come up. So Jen, did you want to share anything first? Saw you unmute.
I was actually going to say more in terms of shared reflection. As I was listening to you, as I was listening to Libby, I think there were a couple of things I heard from both of you that I want to clarify, right? Because we said we were going to try to do a little Clara here for everybody too. You talked about the ways often that people want to approach trauma. And I noticed for both of you that I believe I heard you saying that sometimes people think they know how to approach what they believe is trauma, or how they think they should approach a certain type of people. And you, I think, were both saying you may want to be more humble about that and step back, and ask individuals, or think of ways to get to that person first or community first centering in the way that you establish your dialogue, think about your questions. And that's, I think, really, really important. And I know, like, when I was talking about the Title IX and people who would come into my office for that, I've always said they've never wanted me to label them with one of the words, whether it be, survivor or victim. They just want me to call them by their name and go from there, right? And so I was wondering if you two would reflect a little bit more on that piece of how to help people as they're setting up dialogues think about, this is where you start that centering on individuals or communities and not on the trauma.
Well, I'll just jump in and say my first thought, of course, is if you're working with a population that you do not belong to, I go to them and take their lead, right? And offer support if they need it to help in some ways. But I certainly would start with the people who know what they're talking about, and get guidance from them in terms of how I should best serve.
Yeah, I was trying to think of like a succinct way, because that brought up a lot of thoughts and feelings, Jen, and I appreciate it. So I think the socioeconomic status one example was like, for the caucus part, we asked our facilitators to join whichever group they felt most identified with, that like represented their background, because that was the type of space that we were creating, was that common ground space before we came back. So that was like an intra group, and then we came back as inter group, and we had a dialogue across the different economic statuses. And so I think that was a scaffolding towards being in a mixed group space, if you will, and a way to do what Libby was sharing, which is like folks from the community modeling and experiencing first how like they want to be shared with and about. And then I will maybe answer your question, or maybe something I was just gonna say that something that I reflected on from both of yours that I found to be helpful, and I hope will be obvious to people in this group, but again, not making assumptions, is just how important cultural context is to making all of these decisions. And maybe, for a lack of a better word, that's an unsexy answer, because it means you have to do work each time. Like, there isn't a formula. There are best practices, there's patterns, there's things to like, I probably wouldn't do that have been learned. But in general, the cultural context of folks who have experienced different things, just any of their identities, I guess we'll point out the ones you're sharing, Jen or Libby, but like that matters a lot to anything from which questions are asked to the language that's using. That's why all of a sudden it's like, well, I'm not going to call them survivors in this moment because you just asked me not to. But like, that matters. And so it just takes work each time, which is kind of something I was going to say in mine before, which is like, it is work as a facilitator and someone creating these experiences in the moment and to follow up. And I believe someone from our group shared this in our first workshop, but because we know that it's part of the work, we feel like it's our responsibility is what we were saying. And I would say that for my facilitators, that it's values-based for how we show up for our participants, and then it's the responsibility of our work, and it takes that. So I would just say always having a few different perspectives before I go put something on is helpful. And then like Libby said, someone that actually represents multiple of the communities that are probably in there, right? Because not all Indigenous communities, of course, are a monolith, or even in Alaska. So, yeah, and I have it's more of a question than a full reflection from y'all, but Libby, you were pointing out with some of the resources that you just dropped to people, and Jen, you said something earlier that made me think of it too, but just honoring the different ways of knowing. And I'm wondering how you actually bring that into your practices. I know you all practice it as people. And some of the things that I was thinking of is just today, I was on a webinar for nonprofit leaders about trauma-informed storytelling. And it was so interesting and powerful. And it was about it was calling the story owner as the person it was about the storyteller as the person who's like the nonprofit kind of reporting it and sharing it back out. And then there's like a consumer that's like reading it. And so they made me think of that. I have prompts from a meditation article that talks about like a meditation on trauma. That I have a tarot card spread from an activist online that does tarot relating to systems and oppression work. So what are other like ways of knowing that you all feel like you bring into your work?
Libby, you want to go ahead?
I'm really feeling a desire to hear from everybody. I don't know if you all are okay with that, but I'm curious if we could open it up to everyone who's here.
Yeah, I want to switch over to that. I think I'll just say two things about this is that when I think about ways of knowing, I think about first off, not seeing being uneducated as problematic. And what I mean by that is that we hold up certain types of trained knowing education as somehow superior. And one of the things that I was trying to show people, right, is that part actually takes away from some of the knowledge of self-expression, of community, that is not easily captured, right, within higher ed or Western, knowledge, but also understanding that some knowledge is just don't put things in boxes or don't need to solve certain things. And so I can see this in, like, one of the things that when we talked to a group of biologists who are, you know, all from either Mohawk or Onondaga or Tuscarora, and within the Haudenosaunee, and have Western degrees in biology, one of the things that they said was the hardest to overcome for them in getting those degrees was patriarchy, because their groups are designed around matrilineal knowledge. And so, I mean, some of these things are so deep and so profound in ways of knowing, we don't even know how to recognize it. Another way that I saw that is when therapists were working with individuals who may see themselves as some form of trans identifying or queer identifying, where the counselor was trying to tell them what their sexual or gender identity was based on who they thought they were sleeping with. And it's a famous article where the person says, well, I was with one of my own. And that didn't mean that the identities matched up with the way the counselor said it. It was, this is how I understand this to be a lived experience. So I think that's really important. So I'm going to stop sharing here and say, so in terms of ways of knowledge, I think you have to listen for the knowledge and the way people are expressing things and start to unlearn some of your own knowledge making ways in order to get to that. So now as we think about this community reflection here, community discussion, Amanda, are we giving the facilitation back to Parker at this point? Okay, Parker, it's all yours.
All right. Hello, everyone. Before we move into this part, I just want to let everyone know during this part of the discussion, we will be removing it from the recording. So anything that's brought up or spoken about will stay within this group that we have here today. So I just want to let people know that first before we dive into it. But with that said, we're going to open up the discussion to folks within the chat. If people would like to use the chat as their way of commenting, asking questions, please do so. I'll be facilitating that. If folks would like to, orally say something as well, please use the raise hand emoji or the raise hand option, and I'll be calling on folks in that order as well. So now it's open. If anyone has any comments, reflections, or questions for our presenters. All right, Donna.
Thank you. Wow, so much food for thought here. I have a long list of things to follow up with. One of the things that stood out to me that I really don't use in my facilitation, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about, and Libby, this is specifically to you, is the listening partnerships and how you set that up, what it exactly entails, how you set it up, how you identify partners. I'm wondering if you can share a little bit more about that.
Sure. So as I mentioned, I work primarily, but not only, with faculty across the nation and actually some in South Africa. And this is when I work with them on the strategies best used in the classroom for difficult dialogues. This is always one of two strategies, depending on how much time I have with folks. I always only maybe get to two of them. This is always one of them. It's a very simple one. Some of you already use some version of this, probably in your own teaching. You call it think, pair, share, or you call it listening dyads or something like this. But in essence, it is a strategy where we teach students that we are going to use regularly a practice where we split up usually into two. It can also be bigger than that. The facilitator, the professor, is going to time these exchanges, and they are literally going to take turns listening to one another only. It's pretty simple and straightforward. It's just that people aren't used to it. They're used to conversations. They're used to lots of other things. But literally, it is an exchange where, for example, for 1 minute, I see, is it Jesse Carr? I'm just going to pick on you, that we would be in a partnership, either in a breakout session or in person. And the facilitator would say, okay, pick which one of you wants to go first. And Jess would say, no, I don't want to. And I'd say, okay, I will. And then there would usually be a prompt related to the dialogue that we are having or the issue that we are engaging with, or maybe it's just a trust building one where we're asking questions that are simple, like what kind of food do you like, or what kind of holidays do you celebrate, those kind of things that many of you already do. And so for 1 minute, Jess just listens to me. No interruptions, with relaxation and respect, kind of moderating the nonverbals that go on so that I don't get some kind of editorial coming my way about what I'm saying nonverbally. And after a minute is up, the professor or facilitator says, okay, it's time to switch. Could you gently close out your comments? They do that, and then we change to the other person. The other person then gets a minute for themselves to share, and it is not necessarily or often even invited to be any kind of a comment on the other person's thinking. It is a completely separate opportunity to reflect on the prompt that the person has been given. After that happens, we come back out and people are invited to share only about what they shared, not about what their partner shared. And so I can go on and on. I've taught 16-week classes on this strategy, but it has a lot of good in a very short period of time. Everybody in the class or the group gets heard. People get a chance to organize their thoughts before they have to speak in the group. They get a chance to process some emotions before they speak in the group. Everybody gets equal time, so their voices are equally valued. And I have used this in groups of 1,000. I've used it in groups of 10. And very quickly, the whole group calms down. Right? When we're talking about trauma-informed dialogue, when we're talking about any dialogue these days, because these days almost everything can become a difficult dialogue, it's really, really useful to use this regularly, to train the constituents that you're working with in it, to debrief about what is it like to do that? What does it feel like to listen to somebody for 2 minutes without commenting on anything they're saying, just listening and giving them the sacred space to hear themselves? What is it like to be listened to for 1 minute or 2 minutes uninterrupted? Some people love it, some people hate it. We debrief about what that's like, right? But once people get trained in this process, you can then drop it in throughout the dialogue. Whenever things get heated, whenever something has been said that is maybe potentially disturbing, maybe there's been a lot of information shared and people are starting to get detached, right? Good time to do it, to bring them back into the game. I can go on and on. I hope that's helpful. I'll stop now. Yes, somebody's mentioned mindful listening. There are lots of different listening practices out there. All of them are great in different contexts. This particular one I've sort of adapted for a difficult dialogue situation. Anyway, write me if you want more about it.
Libby, just as a follow-up, thank you. We do a ton of listening. What we don't do typically is pair people up and then return to the same listening pair throughout the course of a dialogue. So that sounds like a trauma-informed practice that we can incorporate.
Yeah. And you can do that as you need to or not, right? And there are ways in which, and again, I don't want to take up too much time, but that you can ensure that people don't get paired up with people who might be triggering for them. There's lots of things about this. I'll put my email in the.
All right, thank you so much, Libby and Donna. Does anyone else have any comments or questions they would like to ask the presenters, or anything they'd like to bring up in the group? We had one question. Oh, go ahead, Andrew.
Okay, hi everyone, I'm Andrew. So yeah, I like how we brought up culture and trauma together. Um, so I was in the Army before and I was sent to the COVID response in New York City, Manhattan. And we basically had to build a hospital at the Javits Center near the Hudson River because the hospitals were just so overflowed that patients who had COVID weren't able to get the help they needed. So we built this large hospital at the Javits Center, and what I noticed was that to screen the patients, a lot of them, I would say most of them were not of European descent. Most of them came from um, South America or Central America, it seemed like. And there was also some of Asian descent. So what they had us do to screen the patients there was, like for me, since I'm Asian, they would have me screen the Asian patients there because of the cultural trauma they've been through here in America, to bring them comfort during um that time of when, the pandemic and COVID happening. And then, with our small Hispanic community we had within the employees there, would were just like overwhelmed with work because of like the mass majority were of Hispanic ethnicity. So just wanted to share that on how it relates, and for comfort in the similarities of culture.
Thank you much. Thank you so much for sharing, Andrew. Um, Amanda, would you like to go?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks so much. So I'll share like my background is I'm in school to be a social worker. So we talk about trauma-informed care in almost every aspect. You can't not talk about trauma-informed, or like I hear the language of trauma-centered in anything that we do, any sort of service. Um, but one thing that I'm very mindful of is also facilitators or practitioners all come to this work with their own stuff, their own trauma, that ought to be addressed. And I would say that also is like an ethical dilemma that I'm hearing brought up throughout today of like, also, how do we implement care for facilitators that are engaging in dialogue? How do we make those pairings and be mindful of social identity experiences and trauma in selecting facilitators and how we train facilitators? So I would just love to hear maybe from that perspective, because I think it's equally important to account for facilitators as much as it is for participants. And yeah, just generally would love to hear a little bit about that.
So I know for our group, so my job is the vice president for DEI, and I'm also the Title IX 688 504 coordinator. Can you tell I work at a small school? But the thing that I would say about that is, so in our team, I'm white and queer, in my 50s, right? Some of these are important identity markers. And I come from the faculty before I went to administration. The other members of my team, two individuals identify as queer. One is a woman of color, very proud Kenyan American, and another is Mohawk identifying, right, male identifying, and then another African American, right, heterosexual. And when certain things come up in our team and we know we have to do a dialogue about it, we have a check-in and say, who has the capacity to do this right now? And how would they need to be supported? Who would need to be paired? And based on that, we know who does what role for something. But we do the check-ins beforehand. We also will use, so you probably, since you're in social work, have heard about the behavioral inventories, right? And knowing that you need to know what your baseline is and when you're losing your baseline, right? And so I think that's important. I think one of the things is to teach people it is professional. It is good practice to understand self-care, to understand self-check-in, to do that for others, and to not always be focused on, well, my title's this, so I should do this, when maybe you need to train a team to do multiple things so that you can give people those needed breathers or step backs. And I also think it's another reason why you use multiple facilitators or have support people there. And I'd be really interested to know what other people think about that kind of framing.
I'll just kick in a couple brief things. I mean, one of the great advantages, frankly, to becoming a member of the Difficult Dialogues National Resource Center, which we are representing ourselves here, is this. We actually do get together. We do have times where we share what it's like to be facilitating dialogue, particularly in these times. We have an upcoming webinar, I think, where we're speaking to this, or we have a conference that's coming in June at WashU in St. Louis, where we'll have sessions on exactly this kind of thing. I personally have belonged to a listening network for over 45 years, where we essentially do what I just described that Donna asked about, listening partners, where I'm listened to on a very regular basis by someone else, and I listen to other people as well. So I have a place to take my experiences and metabolize what I've had and think them through and have some feelings about them and come out with a little clearer perspective on everything. So I really encourage you to find this group or some other group if you're facilitating dialogues where people can support you who are doing the same thing, because it's very hard work, and we all need each other, basically.
Yeah, I'll add in a short comment too. Hopefully it doesn't seem too obvious, but one thing that we would do, so I would say that I believe in that lots of practices, specifically intergroup or sustained, are about having dialogues with the same group of people over a time period, right? So like a series versus a one-off. And one, I would say, personally, I'm speaking, that's inherently more trauma informed than these one-off dialogues. People don't have relationships. You don't know what they're going to say. There hasn't been all this pre-work done. There's not time to do all of this. So having series in general. What my comment on that is, because I've done that, what we've set up, I've had series, is I have a check-in form with facilitators that they fill out in between the session. And yes, a few of the things are basic, like how many people came to the session today. But some of the things are like, where are you stuck in general? And then one of them is like I haven't seen the question in a long time, but basically like, did anything happen in the session today that you need to debrief or that you need to mandate a report, tell me about? And so it gives them space, one, to share things that would need to be like processed beyond, but also for them to say something, and I read those. And so I just, even if they just make little comments, right, I know my team well enough to stick with them and then reach back out. So I think that's a strategy I use, and you have to actually obviously like follow up with anyone you're asking that information from. But then additionally, I really found kind of what Libby's saying, like having a team of facilitators, whether it's just those two co's or whether it's like the small group of leaders we had that met consistently, even though that's one more thing in the list to do, that built up our ability to empathize and be there for each other. Because my last point would just be like, I have asked this before. I work in a university now. I have for a good amount of time, and we hear people's stories, not just in dialogues that are traumas, right? I heard suicide and abortion and immigration stories all in the same week without prompting. And I have asked HR and other mentors, or not mentors, other administrators in my universities before, hey, I'd like a little extra support. I know how to report. I know, don't give me any of the HR lines. I know those, but as a person, I don't want to spend my $180 to process my student secondhand trauma that I'm getting paid for. I'd like to work on my own stuff. And it was really hard because I was wanting someone else that was in our context to support me. And that was really hard to find. And so I'm pointing that out as something that I also feel like I need sometimes. And that is a systemic thing, right? Like as a system, if we're going to have people that are working with folks that are experiencing big T or little t trauma, as I call it, what is the system that we as a group has set up for that? And so I'd say in like a best case scenario, if you're at a smaller group, that you demand that as employees, that like you have counseling as part of it, or you have group time to work through these things. And then lastly, I'm just gonna drop in the chat. Oopsie, sorry, I might have dropped it only to you. I'm dropping in the chat an article that it talks about like another version of self-care is communal care. And just it's a different take on self-care that I've found valuable for the last few years.
Thank you so much. I don't want to pass over the chat, but this also might be great. I do want to bring up Jesse. They're talking about, they're curious if anyone has strategies or approaches for talking with colleagues whose inclination is more towards avoidance. For example, not wanting to raise a topic because it could be triggering, even when discussing the topic is appropriate and necessary. So that came from Jesse in the chat. And I know there was a colleague who commented, but I just wanted to bring that up to the group to see if anyone would like to respond to that.
I know, so this one is always, when I get that comment, I want to ask more questions before I give my like thoughts on how to potentially tackle it. Because depending on how someone's saying that and what you're, getting from them non-verbally or what you've seen in their pattern, you can offer advice that's absolutely useless because they don't, they're not saying it in a certain way or they don't mean it in a certain way. I would say though that if you don't have kind of that deeper background on somebody or how they're going about something, you may want to think about like doing the Clara method and say, okay, why do you think that this is, okay, I hear you saying that you're worried about it being triggering. Can you explain more about that? And one of the reasons that I would do this is think about it as something of a communication blocker. Think about it as something where there may be a specific thing they're concerned about, and can you design, right, in terms of that. But I also think that you need to get to a point where you're able to share with them, you know what? We need to give people the choice to decide what they want to face. And so when we were talking about creating safety, sometimes safety is actually what Manda was talking about, which was it's a brave space and that person wants to enter it, right? But also there's times where it's like you say, hey, in this dialogue, you can pass, or in this dialogue, we have a support person who is going to walk out with anybody who needs someone, right? So we do that in some of those like Title IX events where people want to share their stories, is there's always like an advocate present who can walk out with someone, take them to a private space and do some work with them right then if they need it, right? And so I think knowing whether it's avoidance, getting to the heart of what it is they're saying when they're saying they're worried about it's being triggering is important. And then that's some of that pre-work that we were talking about. So I would definitely say, think about how you remember you're not just in a conversation about taking an action, should we, shouldn't we, but you want to develop a deeper understanding with that person of what they mean by this. And if it is avoidance, how you can then get to a place of understanding what is causing their avoidance and seeing how you can move forward from there.
Thank you, Jen. And then I know you responded in the chat, and I see your hand up as well. So would you like to also comment? Is it Elodie?
Thanks, Berger. Jen, thanks for those reflections, and Jesse, thanks for bringing that question forward. I wonder if, I don't know if it's appropriate to ask this or not, but I wonder if we could talk about it in the context of like the classroom, where it's not like a specific dialogue space, so to speak. Maybe the instructor hasn't set it up. Maybe they haven't come to the point where they've been able to take the time to like create an environment where when difficult conversations emerge, there's a skill of dialogue already sort of present. I'm an educational developer, so I'm working with faculty specifically on this work. And yesterday I was with a group of white faculty members who really care about truth and reconciliation and incorporating Indigenous pedagogies in their courses, centering decolonization. And every single one of them said, I feel ill-equipped to bring up really difficult conversations because I don't want to cause more harm. And I don't feel like I'm a skilled enough facilitator to like foster the learning of the students that's maybe causing harm while tending to the well-being of the other people in the class. And so I feel like it's a bit distinct from a dialogue space, like a formal dialogue space. And I wonder if anyone has any thoughts or places to send me so that I can build my capacity and then support them in building theirs.
I'll jump in. I did see that you privately sent me a message, and I'm delighted to connect with you afterwards about this, because I have what should I say? So there are a range of models of dialogue. Everybody's familiar with that fact, and one of the ones I'm very fond of that I do not practice is the intergroup dialogue that many of my colleagues do practice. And why it's so important is because it happens over time. People do develop those relationships and trust. It's not a one-off, if people have said, right? It has some really enduring impacts. My experience and the work that I do with faculty is recognizing that most of them will never do that. Unless they happen to be in particular fields and so forth and so on. They are responsible for teaching their class on psychology or journalism or economics or physics or whatever it is that they're teaching, and they're not dialogue experts. They're not ever going to be. And nonetheless, these issues come up. Or nonetheless, they should be introducing these issues, right? Because it's our responsibility, in my opinion, right, in higher ed particularly, and at least what we hope continues to be a democracy, to model for our students that we can engage across difference in respectful ways, right? So the work that I do, the book that I put in there that is free online for anybody, it doesn't cost you a dime if you want to download it. It's called Start Talking, a handbook for engaging difficult dialogues in higher education, is in fact a bunch of strategies that faculty can use who are more in this boat that you're describing, right? People who don't have the high skill level and probably never will develop it has been my experience with most of our faculty, right? And we still want them to feel confident enough to introduce appropriate controversial topics in the classroom or to field them when they happen. That book mostly focuses on the planning intentional dialogues as opposed to responding to unintentional ones, which isn't in that particular book. We do workshops about it, but and so it's a series of strategies that they can employ that don't necessarily, well, none of them actually involve what we are calling dialogue, where we're literally talking together directly about the issue of policing in our town, right? Or whatever your issue happens to be. They are more indirect in many ways. There are some that are role playing. There are many that offer students a way of engaging that they don't have to identify their actual opinion on the topic, but you still get to engage on the issue, and so forth and so on. So again, I don't want to take too much time, but that book is available to anyone who wants it. I'm certainly happy to field questions if people have more about that. I hope that's helpful.
And this may be less helpful, but I'm still going to say it. And I feel like Jesse, what Jesse was showing in the chat to me, semi alluded to this, or it made me think of it, is if you have a relationship with these said faculty members, right? Because obviously relationship is a lot of what we're talking about. Where is their space and where is your style come in? Of course, I do not know you, for challenging that some, to be like, yeah, me neither at some point. Like it's effortful. It takes work, and like it's probably not rewarded in the traditional faculty sense either. And me talking to the person, seems like you care about this. This may be a place that you need to invest blank and resources. And then it's nicer, I feel like it comes off better if you can direct them somewhere specifically than being like, go get help. But really, what do you mean is like, go get trained. There are some free ones. There are some paid ones. Could they go as a group, right? Like, is there something related to research and they could use money for that opposed to like paying themselves for something? Could they bring community members with? But that was back to what I was saying before, which it does take values-based action to do some of this work and to be like, yeah, it's my responsibility as someone with more privilege, whether it's educational privileges they might have, or power privilege as faculty, white privilege for myself, to have to work with it. And so be like, I'm so excited that you care enough that you feel like you're maybe not quite equipped yet. I know you can get there. And of course you have to believe that, but so I think that push and challenge, if not you, then who are they going to hear that from? But then I would provide some kind of resource or direction for them, so it doesn't make it sound like you're just trying to tell them to go figure it out.
I mean, in my experience these days is that faculty are actually desperate for this stuff.
Yeah.
That when you do offer them, they're like, oh my gosh, thanks, right? I'm dealing with these things in my classroom. I don't feel confident. Thank you for anything you offer. So whatever you choose to offer, my guess is they will be receptive to it, these days at least.
Yeah, and the type of classes is going to matter, right? What they're teaching, it's going to matter. And as I said, I'm a historian, right? Professor historian, and I kind of bought into a long time ago is rethinking. So I think it's incredibly helpful. If you haven't seen it, the debate, discussion, dialogue breakdown that shows the different ways that we often express ourselves in educational settings. And dialogue is a different thing, but you can incorporate it into classrooms. So I think that's really important. And just say to them, it's like, are you gonna have discussions in class? Are you gonna bring up anything that may have a a point to it, a flashpoint to it? But the other thing is, I think community guidelines for classes are a good idea, and having the students, I see some yeses to that, is having the students help create them, because then you can go back to them. And one of the things we were talking about as a group, and I felt like I got a gold star that day because Libby was like, "Yeah, Jen, that one was good." Is I borrowed from the book Start Talking, the circle of objects, and that's meant to do with intergroup and to really show cultural identity. But I used it in a survey level American history class and said to all the students, go find an object. It can be digital, but you're going to present it to the whole class. And it's about 30 students. And you're going to, and it's going to show your some sort of personal connection to history for you, right? And so I had them all present that. Everybody was just doing a circle. We didn't put it on the table or anything that you typically do. And I said, everybody present it. And when we got to the end, talked a little bit about what everybody had brought up. It was really interesting, shared a lot about themselves, shared their connections. And I said, I want you to realize, think about all these personal connections that people have brought up around history. And there's so many rich issues and whatnot that people are connected to. So anytime we discuss anything in this classroom, we are probably talking about an issue that directly relates to someone in this classroom. So let's show that kind of respect and regard towards each other, right? In how we address it. And it just was like the buy-in there, because they felt heard and they were like, okay, I'm a part of it. And you can do that in a lot of ways. And I think we even saw it here in the way that, people were using the chat to support things, where people made comments, shared things publicly, and other people were like, thank you for sharing, and I'm sorry that happened. And doing that, I also want to kind of go back to some of what Manda said, was faculty members have to stop thinking they can tie it in a bow in every single lecture, in every single class, and fix it for that person. And by the way, you can find the books actually on the DDNRC website. You can find links to them there. But that is, I think, a real problem that we have, is we've gotten stuck in our schedules and where we have to put things. And we have to remember that we, particularly in higher ed, are meant to make thinkers who can continue to think. And it doesn't mean everything gets solved in one lecture, And so I think that's really important. And I think being able to share and work with people who can bring in authenticity and are willing to do that, not putting it on the backs of somebody, right? But working with people who authentically, and I think Andrew brought that up with some of his examples of who did that. So really good ways to think about how you share, or allowing students to be part of who does that. Because possibly one of the most phenomenal things I ever said or saw was in my social activism class, where two young Black men discussed, and I'm not going to say this full word, so just very carefully, discussed the use of the N-word in their community. And it was so enlightening for people to understand different presentations of it and where personal history came into it as to why they would or would never use that word, right? And everybody understood how to be respectful and listen. And that is a real flashpoint to have in a classroom. But they had built that trust together as a group, so that those two young men felt comfortable presenting that as their dialogue in a way in front of everybody. And that made a difference to people. So you can take really hot topics and discuss them, but you have to allow people the space to take responsibility too.
And I just want to point out that the circle of objects, which is one of the strategies she mentioned from the book, is incredibly easy for most faculty to do, right? So they don't get daunted enough that they won't do anything, which is what concerns me the most. Andrew, I think you've been waiting, eh?
We actually need to end.
Okay.
So sorry, Andrew. I think we might have to pause your questions. We're about to wrap up. But
No
if you want to put it in
problem.
the chat so we can share later too, we can go through that.
No, I was gonna I was gonna get into about like the importance of communication because Libby brought up her book about Start Talking. I'm excited to read that because I'm just gonna sum this up instead of talking any further. But uh I actually didn't know how to start talking until my early 30s, which I'm still in. So it was pretty recent. So yeah, now I know starting to talk about your feelings and everything, like you really do get to find yourself and what you need to heal from and your traumas and all this just messed up stuff that you need to know in order to overcome. And that's it.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And as we wrap up, Amanda, would you like to, any last comments?
Yeah, I just was gonna put in the chat for anyone who would like to answer, since I mentioned it before. These are they're heavy topics. I appreciate people's gratitude for this, but we also could have brought up lots of thoughts, feelings, and other things. And so just asking you to add in the chat what fills your jar of hope. Maybe it's something you heard today, you remembered, it reminded you of, you felt. Maybe it's just like, not just, maybe it's your dog, or it's the flowers in the back of Michelle's background. But if you want to put something in there about what fills your jar of hope, I practice this a lot because it is a heavy world out there. And so I'm just writing it out as a reminder to return to the more simple things of life.
And we do have another session coming up, November 15th, I believe it is. You'll probably all get information about it when we send out a message after this. We have the conference coming up next June at WashU and all sorts of things in between. So we'd love to have you stay with us. We'd love to have you as part of our community. And I think we'll be in touch after this, eh?
Yes, and everyone, please check our website out. I know some folks put it in the chat. Also, our email is on the screen. Thank you to our presenters, Amanda, Libby, and Jen, for guiding the conversation, answering questions, giving us insight, helping us along this journey as we all move along and try to be better professionals and help each other in this world. On the screen are the presenters' emails. I know some folks have already put them in the chat. If you need these emails, please ask in the chat as well. And our presenters will be more than willing to give those to you. And then like Libby brought up, we do have another community of care. So look out for that. It's going to be on November 13th from 1 to 2:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And it's going to be creating mindful post-election space and strategies for dialogue. Thank you so much for being here with us today. We made it perfectly on time. We appreciate everybody. Thank you for an amazing conversation, questions and comments. We really appreciate it. We know you took time out of your day to be with us. So again, thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.